Gattegno, one of the things which made me which made me dislike language learning at school was a huge amount of memorization involved. It just seemed like, compared to maths and science, which I enjoyed doing, was this ghastly matter of memorizing all these words and all the rest of it. Language classes were very tedious from that point of view. What is, in the silent way, what role does memorization play?
Memorizing doesn't play any role at all, in fact, or as little as possible. You do have to memorize. There are certain things you have to memorize. For example, you will have to memorize the word rod for rod, but it will be written on the wall. So if you forget, you look up and you have it immediately. Written on a chart, of course, on the wall, not written on the wall. The vocabulary is kept to an absolute minimum, so there's very little to memorize. You'll have to memorize the colors, but there is a minimum of memorization insofar as that's possible. And it's on the wall, as I said. Gattegno saw memory in a very different way from how memory is seen by most people. He spoke of memorization, that's to say, if you need to memorize something that you can't control in any way. For example, this person here is called Piers, this person here is called Mark, etc., etc. Mark could have been Frederick. His parents decided that. I just simply meet him as an adult and he's Mark. That I have to remember. There's another system, and I have to pay for that, right?
The things which are arbitrary, you
have to be paid for. Yes, and they're paid for in mental energy, if you like. Mental glue, exactly. Right. We have another system, which is the retention system. And the retention system is what I use, for example, if I go to a supermarket and I walk into the supermarket and I look around me and I see that as I go in, what I come across first of all is fruit and veg. And then I go a little bit further and I come to the bakery, and I go a bit further and I come to meat, and then further along it's fish and cheeses over here, whatever. And when I go into that supermarket a second time, I know where everything is. Now, I made no effort at all to memorize all that, but I've retained it. I retain it because my eyes are open and because we are systems. We are retention systems. We retain all sorts of things. For example, I'm walking around the supermarket and I see a lady in some sort of dress that strikes me or whatever, and 3 alleys further along, there she is again, and I recognize her. This is part of the retention system. We retain all kinds of things, and it's entirely free. When I'm doing my shopping list, I can sit in the kitchen and I can go around the cupboards mentally. Most of the time I know what I have to put on my list, right? But what I can do is organize the list in the order of the supermarket that I'm going to. And all of that is part of the retention system. None of it has been memorized in the sense of I didn't pay for it.
Yes, when you say free, when you say this comes for free, what you mean is that no effort was involved.
No effort was involved,
right.
Absolutely. I spent no mental energy trying to remember the supermarket. I never said to myself, remember that the fish are the first thing, remember that fruit and veg are at the door. I don't have to do that. I have mental images of all of this. As I have mental images of my kitchen, I have mental images of the school ground that I was in many, many years ago when I was in primary school. I can still see the bedroom that I lived in, the house that I lived in, all of these images. Much of retention is in fact images of all kinds, auditory images, tactile images. One of the things that I get my students to do, not my language students but my teaching students, take a finger like this, put it into a honey pot, right? Can you feel the honey on your finger? Right? Now take your finger out, you might have to shake it a little bit so that there's not much honey on it, and now taste it. Can you taste the honey? And most people say yes, they can. I should say that I'm dealing with French people, so I have a very highly developed...
Oh, you're talking about people evoking it. You're not about
there's no honey pot.
Right, okay.
There's no honey pot. The honey pot is
a virtual honey pot.
Is a virtual honey pot.
Okay.
And you shake your finger because you know that honey is going to be dripping off it.
Yes.
And then you put it in your mouth and you taste the honey and you can evoke the honey. Right? And you can evoke... People get very good at this. You can evoke 10 different sorts of honey. Right, flower honey, and then we have very nice pine honey, for example. I can evoke pine honey, no problem at all. We can evoke thousands of things. When you're doing a recipe, for example, you know that this will go with that because you can evoke both of them and put them together.
Now, what's the relevance of this to language teaching?
The relevance of this to language teaching is if I have the words that the students are going to need on the wall, then they don't have to memorize them, first of all. They will create images of them. They will create mental images. When I point to the words are in certain orders. They are ordered, but certainly to make a sentence, I'm not just going to run across the page like this. The sentence will be wherever it happens to be. But the students create mental images of the pathways that they use to point a sentence, and this helps them to keep it. Another thing which helps them to keep the sentence is the fact that the sentence is not, all the words are written, but the sentence itself is not written. And what's important about this is, if you have a book, for example, you can always flick back to page 55 and just remind yourself what it was. If nothing has been written, then you have to look at the sentences and you have to think, what was that? How did I do that? And you have to go inside. There's an urgency to remember things. There's an urgency to hold things in you that there isn't if you have a book that you can flick back through, right? But I would ask students not to try and memorize anything. What I would ask them to do is watch. Learn to watch. Learn to watch very carefully. Put yourself in your eyes, and I would train them to do this. When I'm using this, for example, I would train them to watch where I point, and I would get them to come out and point as well, so that pointing becomes a gesture as well.
Gattegno talked about ways of knowing, ways in which we can go from being not knowing something to the point of actually knowing something. Right. And what I found when I discovered that he'd produced a list, an inventory of all different ways of knowing, some of them I was quite expecting to see analysis. I was happy with synthesis. I could understand how we come to know things better by creating syntheses. And then I came across acquaintance, and I was quite shocked. I thought, hold on a second, do I ever learn anything by acquaintance? And then I realized, of course, that as you mentioned, going around a supermarket, how am I learning the layout of the supermarket? I'm not memorizing it, I'm not analyzing it. Purely by being in contact with a supermarket for a period of time, I start to know a supermarket. Exactly. And it's always seemed to me that in Silent Way classes, by repeatedly using words in all these very rich and varied situations, we just become acquainted with how a pronoun gets used, we get acquainted with something else, and it just enters me.
Yes, exactly. This is how, the examples that he gave when he spoke about this is how a violinist relates to a violin. This is how a potter relates to his pottery and to the clay. When you're making a pot, for example, you're constantly aware of this and this and this tiny little movements. You've got the pot which is spinning, for example. You're aware of how thick the clay is as you draw it up like this. You're aware of all these kinds of things. So these are a series of awarenesses. It's not just I am aware. I'm aware of this and then this and then this and then this and then this. And each of those is an awareness, if you like. The same as the violin player is aware of pressures and movements, wrist, the way to hold the wrist and all this kind of thing. And there would be no way of counting these awarenesses. And this is what I think he meant by acquaintance. Acquaintance is a description of a learning process where there's no way of counting the awarenesses that are there.
No need to count them and no need to memorize
No need to count them.
They just happen and we deal with them.
And we become more aware, exactly.